Question 4 of the Elizabeth paper is the site study question. It's a 16-mark question, so it's worth 20 to 25 minutes we're looking to spend on it, and we're aiming to bring in about 2 to 3 to 4 paragraphs, depending on what level you're looking for. For the really high levels, we're going to try to write about 3 different aspects and a conclusion. Now, we don't know exactly what they could ask you about this until the exam itself. It could say about a cause question, why are these houses being built? For example, the main reason for building Elizabethan country houses was to show the status of their owner. Or it could focus on change, how are these houses developing over time? The main change that Elizabethan country houses demonstrated was to show the wealth of their owner. Or it could focus on the consequences, the results of these houses being built. The main consequence of building Elizabethan country houses was greater comfort for the owner. But you'll always get asked at the bottom, how far does the study of Hardwick Hall support this statement? And that means we've got to have some good relevant knowledge we can bring in and explain how it supports different areas. Now, this was the previous AQA question, which focused on change, and it looked at new fashions of the time. Now, AQA have said they won't repeat this question, but instead of changes over time with new fashions, it could look at status or wealth in the question, for example. Now, these are the areas I'd want to know before the exam. I think the first 4 are key. How does this property show wealth of the owner? How does it show comfort, that change from medieval houses? How does it show the status of Bess of Hardwick? How does it link with new fashions like the Renaissance? And then just 2 things they might mention that we want to be aware of. How does this house show a loyalty to Elizabeth? We can link that with status later on. Possibly it might ask you about how it was constructed, this idea of local materials as well, which we can talk about briefly at the end. Now, we are looking for 3 paragraphs, like I said, each looking at a different factor. We must include the factor in the question for levels 3 to 4. We've got to talk about that. So if it asks you to talk about wealth, for example, we need to mention that. We also need a conclusion. Which of the 3 does Hardwick Hall most represent and why? And it's so key you leave time for this, at least 20 minutes. Some people like to do these questions first, get them out of the way and spend a decent amount of time on them. That's up to you. So let's look through a potential question together. The main change that Elizabethan country houses demonstrated was to show wealth. How far does the study of Hardwick Hall support this? Well, with Hardwick Hall with wealth, we've got this idea of glass that we could talk about and the sheer amounts that was on display, as you can see from the picture. We've got the furnishings that are in the house. We've got some really expensive furnishings, these Gideon tapestries we can talk about as well. For status, well, we have got those initials ES, emblazoned 6 times on the top of the building we can discuss. And also you've got this idea of the great chain of being, that Elizabethan idea, even being used in the floors of this house, where certain people can't go up to certain areas. You've also got this idea of a staircase that only certain people could use, nobles for example. Or we could talk about comfort of this house. There's no fortifications, which means you've got a garden for relaxing in rather than defence. You've got loggia there where you could walk outside, even in the rain. That's designed for comfort. You've got the warmth from these amount of windows making the house nice and bright and a nice place to sit by. And even the amount of fireplaces you've got to try to keep this building warm compared to what medieval houses would have been like. And it's even shown in the first room. As soon as you step into Hardwick Hall, the first room's a great hall, and you can see it actually points north to south essentially, instead of the traditional west to east. It's moved by a 90-degree angle, and you can see in the picture that lets more light in. And it's the same at the other end as well. This lets more light in and different fireplaces to be keeping the place warm. They're my things I'm going to talk about in this answer, and before I begin, I'm going to decide which I think is more important. I think it's probably status, and I'll explain why in this answer. Again, there is no correct answer for these. So I like to do an introduction with this, no more than 2 lines. It just sets it up so my examiner knows what I'm writing about. So I've just put here, I believe that Hardwick Hall does show evidence of Elizabethan country houses being built for wealth. However, I feel they show status more, and I'll explain why in this answer. So it just sets it up, my examiner knows what I'm going to be talking about and what I believe Hardwick Hall represents more. So, paragraph 1. The first thing you start off with is the theme. I'm telling my examiner what this will be about. I get straight to it with, one change Elizabethan country houses demonstrated was that they were designed to show off the wealth of their owners. So I've got good focus here on that question, on that factor. At this time, the gentry were becoming richer and wanted to build country houses to show their wealth and status in society. So I'm bringing a little bit of overall knowledge about Elizabethan England here, not too much. Now I'm starting to bring in some evidence. How does this link in with Hardwicke Hall? So I've put down there, Bess of Hardwicke had married 4 times, and due to inheritance had become the second most wealthiest woman in England after Elizabeth I. The house was designed to show this wealth. This can be seen in Hardwicke Hall due to its extensive use of glass with its large amounts of windows. These windows were the most distinctive feature of Hardwicke Hall and increased in height from the ground floor to the third. So I've got some good knowledge of the property here. I've got some good knowledge of the owner as well. But actually, I need to explain this now. How does this show wealth? So that's what I move on to. You don't just list what the property has, you actually explain it as well. This shows wealth as glass was an expensive material to produce at the time. And the fact that Bess could afford a house with so much on display would be a visual indicator of how rich she was to anyone who saw the house. She also owns the Wingfield Glass Works, which she inherited from her husband, Talbot. This showed wealth as she had tried to create her own materials due to the glass trade previously collapsing. It is clear that the front of the house was designed as a powerful indicator of wealth to all who saw it. And then I'm going to bring in more evidence to show wealth. I'm not listing lots and lots of things, but I'm bringing in good detail and I'm explaining it. Another example of wealth could be seen with the furnishings in Hardwicke Hall. There were 2 sets of Gideon tapestries which Elizabeth had bought from Christopher Hatton. These were expensive, £100,000, and were used in the upper chambers of the house to impress the nobles who would stay in the long chamber, alongside a range of portraits on display. This meant the Bess wanted to show her wealth to visitors, both inside the house as well as outside. Now, I could list more things that show wealth within the property, but I think I've made my point there with those 2. If I want to, I can always go back and add more once I've finished the exam. But for a higher level, we can also think about being critical here. Is there any evidence that Hardwicke Hall is not based on wealth? And I've just got here, however, I do not believe wealth is the main reason why Hardwicke Hall was built. It was known that Bess was sensible with money and would reuse and fix old items where possible. In the lower floors, she would also use tapestries passed down from her family. And then finally, to conclude that paragraph, I'm just linking back, I'm summing it up. Is this the most important factor about Hardwicke Hall? Therefore, whilst it could be argued that Hardwicke Hall was built to demonstrate wealth due to the amount of glass and expensive furnishings, I do not believe this is true, as wealth is not shown consistently throughout Hardwicke Hall. And this is what that paragraph looks like. We can see that I've started off with my introduction up here very briefly. Then here I've got my theme with a bit of knowledge. I'm bringing in some good knowledge about Hardwicke Hall, but then I move on to explain it. How does it show wealth? And then a second example, and I'm explaining again with detail how it shows wealth. This is where I discuss the fact it might not be the most important reason, and here I'm linking back afterwards. Now, this would be enough to get you some good marks here already. If you're looking for a grade 2 or a grade 2 to grade 4, this is enough that you would have in there. However, what we're looking for is we're looking for a bit more. So let's move on. Status then. And same thing again. Here's my theme. Elizabethan houses also changed during this time to show the status of the owner. Bess of Hardwicke wanted to show that she had risen from lower gentry to the nobles and been the second wealthiest woman in the country. She also wanted to show loyalty to those above her, such as Elizabeth. Hardwicke Hall demonstrates this in a number of ways. I'm then bringing in my first bit of knowledge here. One way were her initials on top of every tower on Flemish-inspired crests. This meant that people could see who owned the house from a long distance and showed her pride in her achievements. Her status was clear and on display. Another way status is shown throughout Hardwicke Hall represents the chain of being. This can be seen from the layout of the house. For example, the outside of the house had 4 rows of windows. The rows at the bottom had a small amount of glass, and this shows where people towards the bottom of the chain would be, and this is where servants would stay. The amount of glass would increase as the rows went up, showing the importance of people in the great chain of being. Best would live on the first floor, and nobles would stay on the second floor if they visited. This again shows Bess's understanding and representation of status. The top floor was designed for the Queen if she ever visited, she never did, with a luxurious bedchamber and a long gallery. Status was also shown through the use of furnishings, and the lower floors of the house decorations would include handmade tapestries. However, at the top where nobles and potentially Elizabeth would stay, there was a lot of money spent on decorations, such as expensive Turkish tapestries or portraits. This would include large portraits of Elizabeth full length to show the Queen's authority and power. This would show visitors she was loyal to Elizabeth and knew her own status in the great chain of being was beneath Elizabeth. And here I'm starting to link back. Therefore, status was shown by Elizabeth in many ways, with her showing pride in position in society with the ES initials on the house, and the use of the great chain of society being shown inside and out. Bess also showed her own recognition of where she stood in society by praising and supporting Elizabeth and showing her loyalty. And all these factors make me believe that Hardwicke Hall demonstrates status more than wealth. Now, if I've got time, I can look for a third paragraph there. So, a final reason why Elizabethan country houses changed was to bring more comfort to the occupants. There was now more political stability in England, with the last battle in England being in 1485. This meant Tudor England was a period of peace and stability, and meant the houses no longer needed to focus on defensive features, and could instead prioritise comfort. So there's my theme. Here's some evidence. One example of this is the outside of the house. The garden now focused on pleasure and relaxation. Evidence of this can be seen in the symmetrical gardens and the loggia for viewing the gardens if it was raining. Rose gardens and seating were provided outside. This was a huge change, as it meant gardens were now being designed for comfort and enjoyment, not just protection with defensive structures and large walls. So again here I'm focused on how it's changed. Another way Hardwicke Hall showed comfort was inside the house. Seating areas were placed close to the large bay windows, and this meant the occupants would have been in warmth in the sun and be able to enjoy the view of the gardens as well, increasing their comfort. The Great Hall was also moved at a 90-degree angle, and this meant that more light and warmth could enter the house from both sides, as well as two fireplaces to keep the warmth. Finally, instead of one large chimney in the house, there were several internal ones, allowing for multiple fireplaces to keep the house warm. And then finally, I'm linking back here. These changes meant Hardwicke Hall could be kept warm for the occupants, and they highlight why comfort was a large change. So again, information about Hardwicke Hall, and I've explained how that shows comfort every time and how it shows changes. And then the conclusion, leave time for this at the ends. So to conclude, I disagree with the statement. I believe that whilst it can be argued the main change in country houses was to show wealth, I feel that Hardwicke Hall does not show this consistently, as there are areas in the lower part of the house that show less expenditure. And this one comes as a surprise. I mentioned this earlier, of course. This just backs up what I've already said. It's a consistent argument. I believe that Hardwicke Hall demonstrates a show of status more, as Bess wanted people to know who she was and her position in society. I feel comfort was important, but just a supporting feature in her showing her status. As the more comfortable the house, the more likely Elizabeth would hear and want to visit. So I'm not just saying what I think is the most important, I'm backing my argument by logically saying why I think it's not the other two, and that pushes me up to the higher levels. And this is what the science looks like in full. And hopefully we can see why you want to leave enough time to spend time to write that down. You want to leave enough time, 10 minutes won't do it. Renaissance and fashions could come up again, or you could write about it again. So windows on the outside, so symmetry and order. Even some of those windows were not needed. They were just built over walls, essentially. It was just to keep that perfect symmetry, a new fashionable idea. The loggia covered the walkway. It's inspired by the Italian Renaissance. There's portraits all over the house, a new idea, including Greek images. Remember that idea of Renaissance and the rebirth of Greek ideas. Pythagoras, for example, pictured here. And there's that long gallery, a large room to display portraits, to walk around, to exercise. This is a new idea to Elizabethan era. This shows a new idea of fashion in architecture. What about the trickier two? Well, if they talked about the loyalty of Elizabeth, there's lots of portraits of nobles and royalty, including Elizabeth's family. You can see in the top left there, we've got Henry VIII. There is a huge portrait of Elizabeth that was sent to Hardwick Hall. It's one of the largest ones in the property. And the idea is that top floor was just left for Elizabeth. And I'd argue that shows Bess was not trying to replace her. She appreciated the great chain of being. She knew where she stood in it. She knew she was beneath Elizabeth, and that's what's being shown there. And local materials, I don't think it will come up, but if it's good to know that a lot of the material is locally supplied because Bess owns the factories, the companies. So, for example, she used her own glass factories to supply the glass for the windows. The lead from the roof came from Bess's own foundries that she owned. And the iron came from her ironworks at Wingfield as well. So things like the fireplaces. And Bess was able to sell this material to others who also wanted to make Elizabethan country houses, and that meant she was able to make even more money for herself as a result. So, these are the questions you could be asked. Again, bringing in those powerful ideas of wealth, status, fashion changes, comfort. Just a few things to think about here. Leave time for this answer. 10 minutes won't do it. 20 to 25 minutes. On the other hand, don't spend an hour on this. There's lots of things you can mention. Try and give 2 good examples for each point, then move on. You can always add more after if you want to. Take the time to plan what you're going to say, what's the most important and why, and show that argument consistently. Make sure you focus on what the question wants. If it's talking about change, then keep explaining how this is a change from the past, how these are new ideas. And make sure you've got some different viewpoints as well, some other different factors, not just the factor in a question, but also other ideas like we looked at here, at least 2 other viewpoints. You can plan those before. And then finally, that conclusion is so important. There is no correct answer. Your examiner isn't looking for you to talk about a certain thing, but really clear. Do you agree or disagree with the statements? And explain why. Justify your viewpoint like you saw in this answer.